So we are live streaming. My name is Dr. Grace Telesco, and I'm with the Fischler College of Education, School of Criminal Justice. We are now on YouTube, and I am joined by my very good friend who we just were talking about that we have been doing this now for a year. It's actually pretty soon going to be a year. Like we can't even believe it. But Ed Dentzel from Unfound. And for those of you who have been following us and following our regular monthly broadcast, because now it is a monthly broadcast. That's definitely what we've been doing. And our next one will be April 22nd. We just solidified that before we went live. And it's just been really exciting. There's a beautiful collaboration between the show Unfound, of course, Ed Dentzel, who is the face of Unfound. So it's a really great collaboration that we have here. And it's been wonderful. We've been doing a lot of different, looking at investigating a lot of different cases, listening to the facts. One of the great things that I love a lot of things about Ed, but one of the things I really love about him and the way he contextualizes everything is that it's just the facts, without a lot of theory, without a lot of spin, without a lot of conjecture or putting anything in there opinion based. And the other really great thing about Ed's work is that he really gives voice to those who are missing. He gives voice to the families. He gives voice to those individuals who remain unfound. And so, Ed, with no further ado, tonight we have a very, very interesting case. While the missing person case itself is old, there's very new information and developments. So, without any further ado, Ed Dentzel from Unfound.
Dr. Telesco, it's good to be with you again. I was joking around. Yes, it's almost been a year. It'll be April. It'll be a year since we were introduced with the help of my assistant, Natasha. I cannot thank her enough. And in fact, I made the joke that when we first met, I actually had short hair. That's how long it's been. But it's good to be on the program again. And you're right. The disappearance murder that we now know as a murder is unique in Unfound's catalog. This was a special episode that was produced in October of 2019, so about a year and a half ago. And I'm going to go through how it all happened, why this is a special episode compared to all of the other episodes that Unfound has done in the last 4.5 years. We are now over 200 disappearances covered, and we now have almost a total of 240 episodes. I can't even imagine it. I can't even imagine back in August of 2016 that the program would be as successful it is, as much listened to as it is, and everybody that is joined on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and everywhere else. I just feel so thankful. I tell people I'm one of the luckiest people in the world. But this case sticks out for its uniqueness in that it was a disappearance and then it became a murder, and then Unfound covered it after that. So it is the disappearance / murder of Janelle Matthews. She was 12 years old from Greeley, Colorado, and she disappeared originally on December 20th, 1984. And by the way, if you see me looking off to my left or your right, I'm looking at my notes. I cannot do a lot of this off the top of my head. And I just want to make the disclaimer that I've never spoken to anybody in Janelle's family, okay? And you will understand why here in a bit, because the way we ended up covering this case was very, very unique, and you'll see why. As I think all of you now know, if you've watched myself with Dr. Telesco before, and even if you listen to the episodes of Unfound, you know I like to work with themes. You know that for me, it's all about education, not only trying to educate the public about missing persons cases, but what can I learn? What can my assistants learn? And how do we apply those lessons to disappearances we've covered in the past, and disappearances that we will cover in the future. We are all about education. And in fact, I was just talking to somebody within the last couple of days, trying to apply like the scientific method to missing persons cases. If you have a case over here, does this apply to any other disappearances that have occurred? And once again, as Dr. Telesco said, just looking at the facts themselves and seeing if we can relate and learn things by studying different kinds of disappearances. So these are my 3 points to ponder / lessons to learn, missing persons theory concepts for tonight. Number 1, was the missing person the crime or unfortunately became part of the crime? And we have some examples from Unfound's catalog of cases that I will eventually mention. Number 2, what are we to do about people who infuse themselves into missing persons cases? I will again give some examples of that, and probably the best known one over the last 25 years, although we have not covered that case. And number 3, are stranger on stranger crimes more common than we believe? These are the 3 points, lessons that we're going to be thinking about tonight as I go through these facts. Now, the facts of Jolene's disappearance as it occurred in 1984 are fairly straightforward. She's 12 years old. She was at a Christmas concert, and I believe we have a picture of that night where she is in the course there at the, must have been maybe elementary school. And there she is right there. That is from the evening that she disappeared. This would have been just hours before she disappeared. And I think this is part of a screenshot of a video that was taken that evening. She was driven home by her friend's father, Russell Ross. And Russell's daughter was also in the concert, the same age. And she was also in the car with Janelle and her father. And Russell Ross will play an important role later, maybe even coincidentally. Janelle gets dropped off. No one was home. Although the garage door, what Russell Ross said is when he dropped her off, he remembered that the garage door was open on the house, although he did not remember if he knew that nobody was going to be home or not. Her father came home about an hour later, so around, I think, 7 to 8 o'clock, and Janelle wasn't there. She was never seen again. All right, so once again, the facts of this disappearance are fairly straightforward. They are not in dispute. It was investigated. No signs of violence inside the house. No signs of a break-in. Nothing. And in fact, we have a disappearance that we've covered on Unfound that is very similar that I will go through in a little bit. But then, so this case, at least from the investigation side, no clues really pop up at all for 35 years. So 1984. Then in 2019, there was some ground being dug up outside of Greeley, Colorado, I believe to the south of town, for a gas line, oil line, something like that. So it's a crew out there in this field just digging this line along, and they come across some remains that were buried in this field, not near a river, not in a forest or anything like that, just right out in this field. Remains there, obviously, of a young person, unknown if it was a boy or a girl, and the remains were tested. DNA was done, testing was done, and it was discovered that this was Janelle Matthews. And it is believed that her remains had been there for 35 years. And so, of course, this all started up an additional investigation. Now it was not a missing persons case anymore. It was now a murder investigation.
So Ed, just to kind of clarify, what was the year when the remains were found?
2019, just 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago. We're coming up on the 2-year anniversary.
Which is the reason why we kind of said it's an old case, but a new case.
That's right. So this disappearance happened in 1984, just as we cover most of the time or all the time on Unfound. And I can tell you that we could have covered this case as a disappearance, as a regular disappearance in 2016, 2017, 2018, because it is a disappearance. But then in 2019, when her remains are dug up pretty much by accident, just luck that they came across her remains. It then became a murder investigation. There was something that on the remains, the skeleton, that let investigators know that this young person who they found out to be Janelle was murdered somehow. Okay. Although I'm not sure it's been put out there exactly how. So I will tell you, though, some points that are still unknown to me in knowing about this case for almost 2 years now. We don't know exactly how often Janelle was home by herself. Did Janelle herself know she would be home alone that evening when getting dropped off? Who else could have known that she would be home by herself? Were there any signs of a break-in? There's never been anything announced like that. So usually they do say something like that. That's never been said. So I'm taking for granted that there were no signs of break-in, and there were surely no signs of violence in the house. Although I have heard that there were footprints. This is Colorado. It is December. And so there was probably snow on the ground, and footprints were around the house. Although I don't think that they could ever be attached to anyone because they were in snow and not in mud or something like that. So what then happens? So this happens, and I can tell you at the time when this all happened in 2019, when her remains were discovered, it was not even on my radar. I maybe read a news story about it, but everybody knows, my assistants especially, that when I'm working on Unfound cases, I really don't pay attention to a lot of other things going on out there. That's just the way I am. I'm very concentrating. I'm just keeping my eye on my own work. Well, what happened was in August of 2019, a guy named Steve became a Patreon supporter, patreon.com/Unfound podcast. He became a Patreon supporter of the program, just like any other person then or now who supports the program monetarily on a monthly basis. And later, though, he emailed me, he contacted me, and he revealed that I think it was he asked me about Janelle Matthews, the remains being found. And then he eventually revealed his last name and said, I'm the guy that they suspect who murdered Janelle back in 1984. And I would like to come on your program to talk about it and how I'm being railroaded, how I didn't do it, how I believe the Greeley Police Department is after me, on and on and on. Okay, so I ended up looking him up. I would find out later, not at the time, but even after I interviewed him for the program, that he had done this to other programs like Unfound. He, in August of 2019, he monetarily, through Patreon or PayPal, contributed to other programs, I think trying to get attention to himself so he could be on those programs to talk about, just like I said, how the police have been after him for all these years for something that he didn't do. It ends up that I was one of the few, if maybe the only one, who took him up on this offer to come on the program. But I have to tell you, it was not an easy decision for me. And, I'm going to scroll down my notes here just a little bit. And I finally decided to do it. I talked this over with my assistants. And the reason was that Unfound follows a very specific formula to covering cases. We talk to mostly family members, and then sometimes I have a couple true crime bloggers on who I believe do great work. That's what I do. Those are the people who I interview. And so when you go to the other side of it, somebody who's a suspect, I have to start thinking, what are families going to think about this? Me giving a voice to the other side, somebody who's going to come on here and say, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. Not only on top of that, it wasn't a disappearance anymore. It was a murder, and I don't cover murders where there are remains or bodies left behind. We are a missing persons program. So I talked this over with my assistants who I trust. They've become very good friends of mine. And if I may name them, Emily, Cherie, Carrie, Heather, Eric, and Natasha. And although I don't think Natasha was with us at the time, they said, you know what, you need to do this. And so at that point, I just became a regular reporter. I was not a specialist in missing persons anymore. I became just the guy who's going to talk to this person who wants to get his story out there. And he had done interviews in the past, but I said, okay, I'm going to do this. So what I said to Steve was this: okay, I'll interview you, but I get to ask any question that I want. And if any point during this interview, now it wasn't live, it was recorded, at any time that you say, well, I'm not going to answer that, the interview is over. All right. Because I have other people to talk to. I have a program. I have families to talk to about their missing persons cases. So if you're going to ask me to do this, then we have to do this my way.
Right.
All right. So if you agree to that, we'll do it.
So then that probably brought you back to your journalist days.
Yeah, well, I guess I don't know how many journalist days I have, but I have the interview experience. If there was ever a person in the true crime community, I think, who could interview him, it would be me, because I do interviews every week.
And was this the first time that someone who was a possible suspect had reached out to you?
In this way, yes. I will tell you that I even have it written down that a couple of cases, I ended up speaking to a suspect after the fact with the disappearance of Judith Emke, which is a disappearance from Tennessee. I think also going back to the 80s. I contacted him after the fact. We tracked him down, and he was willing to talk to me, but it was after the episode came out. And also in the disappearances of Jansen Brewer and Daniel Braden, after the fact, after the episode came out, a guy who was mentioned as a suspect in that episode got all ticked off, said he wanted to talk to me. And we had a conversation over Messenger, and eventually the DA in that county where those two young men disappeared found out that I interviewed this guy and wanted a copy of the conversation, which I, of course, sent them. And that would have been sometime in the summer of 2019 that happened. So I've done this, but usually after the fact, after episodes have already come out. And then I let the listeners know. And these conversations are not necessarily recorded, although through Messenger or whatever, but never in an official capacity like this. Okay, never. And I have not done anything like this, although I'm not ruling it out. So I got to ask Steve any questions that he wanted. If he refused to answer any questions, the interview would be over and it would be like it never existed. He agreed. We did the interview, and the interview is over 3 hours. The episode itself is over 4 hours, one of the longest in Unfound's history, and it came out on November 4th, 2019. I'm not going to say that I believe he told the entire truth or lied the entire time. That is always up for the listeners and the audience to decide. I just try to ask the toughest questions that I can. And that is the situation with families or anybody else who was on the program. It's up to the audience to determine what they think, given what the answers are. And you should know the sum of the parts was that he totally denies killing Janelle, and he had nothing to do with her murder. Okay, so this is how this all happened. Now, I'm going to go just through some of the details of that interview. All right. But if you want to listen to the entire thing and you have 4 hours on your hand, some time on your hands, then you should go listen to that. And I would urge you to do that. You can find this episode on Podomatic, Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, all the popular podcasting platforms. And it came out November 4th, 2019. First of all, you have to understand that Steve Pankey is a strange guy. Whether he killed Janelle or not, he is a weird cat. I've only ever talked to him once on the phone, and that was for the interview. I've not talked to him on the phone since, although he did send me some emails back and forth. We emailed back and forth after that, but I don't think that that's happened since maybe early 2020. The only time I spoke to him live on the phone was during that interview that now everybody can hear. He is a guy who ran for office in the state of Idaho. He's done other interviews in the past regarding Janelle Matthews' disappearance at the time, and now we know murder. And he loves to talk. He loves to talk about himself. He loves to talk about everything that went on at that time. He'll just reveal everything about his life if you let him. And he does in some other interviews, but for the purposes of the interview that I did, we really, really, really tried to just stick to Janelle Matthews, but he'll happily tell you about when he's a young man and all sorts of stuff that have nothing to do with her case at all. He's just different. But here's his story. He says on the day before and the day of December 20th, 1984, he was preparing to go on a trip with his wife and children, and he did live in Greeley, Colorado. Says he did not hear about Janelle's disappearance until the trip was over, possibly on the way home, like on the radio, possibly. The very next day after he got back, so we're now talking somewhere around Christmas of 1984, he claims, this is what the story he told, that he was at home and his father-in-law, who didn't live too far away, so his wife's father, who didn't live too far away, they did not have much, Steve did not have much of a relationship with him. He claims that his father-in-law came over as Steve was unpacking the car after this trip. Wife's inside, children are inside. And the father-in-law says, somebody has asked me to bury a body for them. And the next words out of the father-in-law's mouth was, and it doesn't look good for you, Steve. That's what he said. And this father-in-law inferred that he got the feeling that police were going to try to pin whoever's body this is. Janelle Matthews's name never came up in this conversation, Steve claims. But the father-in-law tried to portray it as if the police and other people in that community were going to try to pin this body that he was going to bury. So father-in-law becomes part of the crime, I guess. They were going to try to pin the this death, this murder on Steve. This is Steve's story. Once again, it's up to you to determine why that is and why. We'll get to that. So at no time was Janelle Matthews mentioned in this conversation, but it was just days after she had gone missing. Steve told me in the interview that he did not tell his wife about this at all. And the topic never came up with his father-in-law again. And Steve says, I have no idea at all, what went on. I didn't want to ask or anything else. However, once it became 1985, so let's say a week later, 10 days later, Steve said that he finally decided, you know what? I got to go to the police with this. So he went to the police and told them about the father-in-law's story. And Steve will claim that from that moment, because he says he was doing a civic duty and saying what the father-in-law said, that Steve himself then became the number one suspect in what now was known to be Janelle Matthews' disappearance. And Steve claims since then, they have been trying to pin her disappearance and now murder on him. This is what he claims. And over the years, yes, they've tried to pin it on him, and they've served warrants on him at the time. They found nothing. They interrogated him. They tried to harass him and everything, and trying to admit that he caused her disappearance and that he murdered her. And he said, I didn't do it. And that is what he's been saying since 1984. And this goes back to one of the points I brought up. It's one of those things. Is Steve a suspect because he infused himself into the disappearance by showing up there and telling them what his father-in-law allegedly said? Or is he a suspect because there might have been proof that he did something to Janelle and he's lying about this story regarding the father-in-law, but they just didn't have enough on him because, of course, Janelle's remains were missing for 35 years. So Steve says he had nothing to do with Janelle's death, did not know her family, did not know her, did not even live close to where the Matthewses lived. What I think he said, he lived at least 1.5 miles away. I know that doesn't sound very far, but it's in a town/city. So there are a lot of people who, of course, live closer to the Matthews than Steve Pankey did. Now, what Steve says, and the reason he believes that they've come after him and have done so over all of these years. And it's this, and it's a little bit convoluted, but just hang with me for a moment. Steve's theory. Well, remember Russell Ross? I told you to remember him. Well, he was the guy who drove Janelle home that evening, and his daughter was also there. Well, coincidentally, Russell Ross and Steve Pankey used to work together at a 7-Up bottling plant in Greeley, Colorado in the early 80s. And that Steve says that Russell Ross and these others didn't like him because at some point Steve filed a lawsuit against the company. Harassment, or they were doing things wrong, something like a whistleblower, something like that. And because of that, Russell and all these other people at this plant got ticked off at him. In addition, the current 2021, I think he's still the mayor, at least he was in 2019, the current mayor of Greeley, Colorado, whose name is John Gates, was a police officer in Greeley, Colorado at the time of Janelle's disappearance. And coincidentally, his family owned that bottling company. Now, you should know I got to speak to Russell Ross on the phone, and I also had an email exchange with John Gates, and I will tell you about that here in a moment. So it's because just to make sure, being that once the interview was done and I knew that he mentioned these names, I thought, you know what, I'm going to contact these people and see if they want to talk. Russell Ross did talk to me on the phone. And like I said, John Gates, even though he's the mayor of Greeley, Colorado, he did get back to me and offered me a statement. And I'll tell you once again what both said. So in Steve's mind, these people were trying to pin Janelle's murder on him because he was a whistleblower or whatever he was regarding this lawsuit at this plant a few years before that. This is his thinking. I spoke to Russell Ross. Here's what he says. This is what Russell Ross told me. This phone call was not recorded. I just took some notes as he was talking. He says he barely remembers Steve Pankey. In fact, he says that he and Steve did not even work in the same parts of the plant. No time after Janelle, and Russell Ross says he had a lot of guilt about dropping Janelle off and then her going missing. Has a lot of guilt that he says he still has because in addition, his daughter and Janelle were friends. At no time in the past 35 years did he ever even know that Steve was a suspect in Janelle's disappearance. He said he never heard that, and he still lives there in Greeley. He had never heard anything about concerning Steve being connected to Janelle. At no time did he have any contact with Steve after Steve left the company. I think Steve left first and Russell continued to work there. And I even asked him this, being that it does seem like this weird coincidence. If we were to suspect Steve, what are the odds that his former coworker drops Janelle off and then Steve is there to go to her house and get her somehow? I even asked Russell, did you ever get the idea at any point that Steve Pankey was following you, kind of stalking you, keeping an eye on you, keeping an eye on you, keeping an eye on your family, keeping an eye on your daughter? He goes, no, I just, no, never. So that is something that still has to be worked out regarding this case. So I also got to speak to John. I didn't get to speak to him. It was an email exchange. I had an email exchange with John Gates, who I believe is still the current mayor of Greeley, Colorado. He called. I told him that I'd done this interview and it was going to be coming out, and his name came out, and would he like to comment? John says, and remember, he was a police officer in 1984 when this happened, and his family owned that bottling company. He called everything that Steve said about Janelle's disappearance / murder over the years ramblings. That's in quotes, ramblings. In addition, what John says is that he says his family did own the bottling company, the 7-Up bottling company in Greeley, but they had sold it a few years before he believes Steve ever worked there. This is John Gates. I've not looked into that. I'm guessing that if he's going to say it must be true, because that would be something that you probably could go back into the paperwork, but I will admit that I have not done that. I will admit it. But so that was enough for him to say that, okay, so the John Gase's family didn't own the bottling company when this lawsuit, whatever Steve did in the early 80s. And you should know, the way I remember it, Russell Ross didn't even remember anything about this lawsuit, but I think it did happen. So now we have to figure out if Steve is the culprit, if he's the perpetrator, if he is the murderer, what connections could there be between Steve and Janelle? Of course, remember, his alibi is that he was preparing to go on this trip, a trip that his family went on. Well, he was a member of the church where Janelle's family went to church. And in fact, I think he wasn't just a member there. I think at one point he was kind of like higher up in the church. I don't know if he was like the leader or the pastor or the priest or anything like that, but he was an elder or something like that in this church. I don't think was just a regular, I think he might've taught Bible classes or something like that. However, Steve and his family did not live near Janelle's family. But Steve, as he will gladly tell you if you ask, Steve did have felonies in the 70s, in the 80s. Okay, so he did have a criminal record for a variety of things, but I don't know if anything along the lines of, kidnapping a 12-year-old girl. So, however, if police had anything to do, we have to think of it this way. If police had anything on him from the crime scene in 1984, they have never revealed it. And not then and not now. And in fact, as I have stated, once, and you should know, come 2020, so about a year after I interviewed Steve, he was charged with Janelle's murder. He is now in jail awaiting trial here in 2021. The prosecutor / DA, when this happened, came out because it's a high profile case. And there's a picture right there of Steve, I think when he was campaigning for a political position in Idaho. There he is. There's Steve again. And then there's Steve after he got charged with Janelle's murder in, Orange is the New Black, I guess. And when they came out and did this press conference, the DA and the prosecutor did not offer up one reason other than they've just suspected him all along to charge him with Janelle's murder. They did not offer up any evidence in my mind, even hints of it, that Steve was the killer of Janelle. Whereas I can tell you in other disappearances that we've covered, when finally a suspect was named and charged, that the police usually do that. So it was quite a contrast compared to what they did in Greeley and the experience I have with other cases that have kind of gone down this road when remains have been found. So to connect Steve to her murder, how did he end up on Janelle Street on that evening? How did he know she would be home alone? And is it a coincidence that Steve's former coworker at the 7-Up bottling plant was the one who drove Janelle home? So this brings us the whole way back to our points that I brought up before I started all of this, talking for the last 25 minutes. So once again, number one, was Janelle the crime, or did she become the crime? Meaning, did somebody go to that house looking to attack her, kidnap her, and kill her? Or was it a situation where maybe she got dropped off and there was already somebody in the house trying to rob it because it was empty, because the garage door was open? Or was she there and somebody broke in or came in, saw the garage door open, and didn't know that she was there at home already? We have a disappearance that we covered from La Crosse, Wisconsin, going way back to the 1950s that is exactly like this. The disappearance of Evelyn Hartley, who I think was just a few years older. She was babysitting at somebody else's house in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And the parents came home to find A lamp knocked over. There was obviously somebody had broken into the house. Evelyn was gone. The baby was unharmed, very fortunately. But that's a case that's almost 70 years old, still unsolved. Evelyn, alive or deceased, has never been found. And to this day, nobody seems to know, did this person go into this house looking to rob it and Evelyn was there? Or was Evelyn the target of this? Nobody knows. No, at least in the public knows. So number two, people who infuse themselves into disappearances. This is probably more common than people think. People who, working at a 7-Eleven, 2 a.m, they'll say they saw a missing person. Yeah, that young woman who's missing. Yeah, I could swear she was here at 2 a.m. I swear it's her. Police go to the videotape. Not her. In fact, a lot of times there's not even anybody there. People just making things up to get the attention. And I can tell you, Steve Pankey is that type of person. He loves the attention. He loves to talk about himself, loves it. But he's also, in my opinion, very paranoid. We had this happen in Suzanne Lyle's disappearance, the very first case that we covered on Unfound, where after she went missing, her boyfriend / ex-boyfriend's father said he was seeing Suzanne everywhere. He'd call the police, say, I saw her today. Well, the police started following him and they found out that he was just making this stuff up. They were like shadowing him and they would be actually watching him as he was calling the police saying, yeah, I just saw Susie. He was just making it up. So this happens. And probably the most common instance of this is John Mark Carr. Who is he? He's the guy who claimed that he killed John Benet Ramsey. Well, it turns out he wasn't even in the United States at the time of her murder, coincidentally also in Colorado. Important, and there's no proof that, so the most important part, at least to the public over the last 30 some years, is there's no proof that Steve would have ever been a suspect had he not gone to police with the story about his father-in-law in early 1985. To this day, I've never heard anything to the contrary. And then finally, I spoke the third point is stranger on stranger crime. I think we're now, because as far as we can tell, Steve and Janelle were strangers. They might have gone to the same church, but nobody's come forward to say, oh yeah, he taught her in Bible study. Yes, their families knew each other, on and on and on. Nobody in the last 30 some years has said that. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying there's no information out there like that yet. Maybe they will. Maybe that will come out. But DNA, I think, is showing, though, going back to the 1980s and earlier, as these older crimes get solved, is that a lot of these cases, maybe there's a higher percentage of stranger on stranger crime than we think. I think that that's showing. And so maybe that could then lead to us believing that somehow Steve ended up on that street and did something to Janelle for whatever reason. And most recently, we're covering a case tomorrow on Unfound that is a stranger on stranger disappearance, where a young man, Fernando Castro, abducted and surely murdered Pearl Pinson, but her remains have not been found yet. And those two were strangers. So that is, in a nutshell, I know I've gone for a while here, but it's a 4-hour episode. I tried to condense it, but that is everything that we've been through on Unfound regarding Janelle Matthews' murder, and then my interview with Steve Pankey and everything else that he's done over the years, doing other interviews, etc.
So, wow. So that's a lot. And I also want to be able to save some time at the end for our students to come on, our criminal justice students, Josh Enfinger and David Troxel, later on, to come on and maybe ask some questions. But so it's true that he's being held on $5 million bail. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right. So that's number one.
He's in jail. Yes.
The trial is set for June. Am I right?
I have to admit that I did not check and see when the trial was going to be, but it could be this year. Of course, that depends on COVID and a lot of other things. A lot of things have gotten pushed back, but it surely could be this year. Sure. June could happen.
So here's my big question from a criminal justice law enforcement, perspective. having spent 20 years in the NYPD and investigating cases and just knowing about various charges. Well, the police have to have probable cause. And then I'm sure that there was a grand jury indictment. There had to be that the evidence, whatever the evidence was brought to a grand jury for what we call a true bill, right? Which means it's really just rubber stamping the fact that the police have probable cause. All you need is probable cause to make an arrest. You need beyond a reasonable doubt to convict. And beyond a reasonable doubt means unanimous. Like it means it's not preponderance of the evidence, which you have in a civil case.
Right.
It's beyond the reasonable doubt. And then the doubt has to be reasonable. But before we even go there, they have to provide the grand jury with the evidence. And the grand jury comes back and says, yes, the police had probable cause. So my question is, and I don't even know if we have an answer to this, is what evidence do they have?
Nobody knows. And that's
Well,
and see
somebody
this,
knows.
and you should know from my standpoint, this is rare because we covered the disappearance of Kamisha Hollis, and her boyfriend, the father of her children, is also going to be going to trial this year, but she is still missing. And I can remember interviewing, was it her sister? And we were going through the evidence during my interview with her, official interview for the program. And I can even tell you that I said, you know, if they're going to charge the boyfriend with her disappearance and her death, I hope they have more than this. Because at the time, it seemed a little dicey. There were a lot of what I call wiggle room, a lot of wiggle room in there.
But you
Well,
know,
a month later, the DA, the prosecutor for that, did charge him. And what happened? This guy came out and said, yeah, we have these additional evidence that was not covered in the interview because the guest did not know it. I apply those same standards to Steve's, and it's just not the same. The DA prosecutor came out and said less than the information that has been out there over all these years regarding Janelle Matthews' disappearance and now murder. He did not say anything additional other than, well, we've had him on our list for a long time. We suspect that he did this, and that's about it.
no, that can't be. It's not.
Oh, well,
it's
I know that,
not-
but you know,
why are they? Why,
I guess what I'm asking you is, being that you are the police officer, you have the experience, I do not, is that were they really just waiting 35 years to find a body? They had all this evidence against Steve, but they really wanted to make sure and just waited for the body. That stretches my imagination a little bit, because we do have cases where people have been brought to trial and convicted without bodies. And if it was so convincing that Steve did it, you know, what evidence really could have been on Janelle Matthews' remains when they were recovered in 2019 that could have pointed towards Steve Pankey? Really, 35 years later, DNA would be totally ruined by that point. It would just not be applicable. So I don't know.
I don't know. There's got to be something that a judge holds someone on $5 million bail with sketchy evidence. It just, something doesn't compute. Now, what does sound like it might compute is the fact that the suspect has inserted himself and said, hello, look at me, and then
that's right.
And then that makes them, you know, red flags, and then go follow that evidence wherever it leads you. And it may have led in the direction of, you know, this is the guy.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, it would be really interesting, and it will be interesting to see if at the trial, if there's any information that we can get, and then to kind of do a follow-up. It would be really interesting to kind of follow the case.
Yeah.
As it's coming up. It should be in June, it looks like, and there's going to be some pretrial motions that are going to happen before that. But
you know, what I would say is that, I guess from my standpoint, you should know that myself and my assistants, we kind of differ on the guilt of Steve Pankey. But what I continue to say is, outside of him just infusing himself into the case and going to police and having this, what some may say, a crazy story about his father-in-law, there has been never any evidence released that he should be connected to her death. It's not like they live next door. It's not like there's a video of his car going down her street that evening. There's never been any news that there are fingerprints found or anything, because surely if fingerprints had been found at her house, for example, that would have been enough, I think, in 1984, 85 to charge him. Given that she's missing and he shouldn't have been in that area and can't explain why his fingerprints are on her house. That should be enough. Wasn't done. They served warrants on him over the years, never charged him with anything. They served warrants on him just before I interviewed him, and he still remained a free man for an additional year after I interviewed him. I don't know. Once again, these are some law enforcement legalities in the process that I'm not as familiar with as you are.
Yeah. Do you know, it'd be interesting to know if this is going to be public, if public has access into the trial.
Maybe it's big. It was national news, especially considering that he ran for office in Idaho and everything else.
Yeah.
Certainly it could be.
Yeah. So we'll want to keep an eye on that. I have a couple of comments. So from some of the viewers, and then we'll bring Josh and David on.
Yeah.
So this is Alexa Albanese. Do you think the suspect is so active in other podcasts to distract the police from a larger truth?
Well, I don't know what the larger truth would be, but I will tell you that I did not find out, I think, until after I interviewed him, that he had tried to get on other programs and had given money through Patreon and other venues to other programs. In fact, a guy who I really respect within the true crime community, John Lorden, I just did a show with him a couple months ago. Steve contacted him. And when John found out who he was, John gave his money back. I will admit that I didn't, because my attitude was, if Steve wants to pay for me to put him in jail, then I'm more than happy enough to take his money if he's a killer. Right. So I'm more than happy to put that money to a good cause. So that was my attitude. John can do what he wants. I did what I want. Right. But a larger truth, I don't know what that larger truth would be. Okay. But is he getting railroaded? Steve believes that. I don't know how many other people believe that.
Yeah. But can you speak to this picture?
Yeah, this is Janelle's house. This is Janelle's house, and that garage door you see on the left there. What Russell Ross said at the time is that garage door was up. I don't know if it was the whole way up. It might have only been halfway up or something, but he said that it was definitely up and open, I guess you'd say, when he dropped Janelle off that evening.
Now, did you say that fingerprints were found?
No, to my knowledge, no fingerprints were found. Okay. That was just an example of, if they had Steve's fingerprints at the scene, you'd think he would have been charged a long time ago. There were footprints there, but footprints in the snow, I don't know how scientific that would be. I think if they were footprints in mud or something, it'd be a little different. With snow, it can melt, I just don't know.
What is this picture?
This is a picture of her family, and these are other missing persons cases in Colorado, I believe. And as you could tell, this is, I'm guessing, a photo that's quite a few years old, going back to the 1980s. Of course, Janelle is up there in the right-hand corner. Right. And Sean Evans, I don't know about these other disappearances, whether they are still unsolved or not. But this was one of the press events that her family did back then.
Okay. All right. So I'm bringing on our two amazing criminal justice seniors who are going to graduate. Ed, they're going to graduate in May. It's a few more months before I have to say goodbye to them. And it's heartbreaking. Like you talk about.
You have to kick them out of the nest, right? Yeah. You have to kick them out of the nest.
You talk about your assistants, and these two are very near and dear to my heart. And so anyway, I'm going to give them the opportunity to talk to you and ask maybe some questions about the case. This case is, to me, they're all important and they're all so fascinating. This one in particular is one that we really want to, I think we want to like go and tune in again and maybe have like another show,
Sure.
on Janelle, maybe
Yeah.
in July or August,
If the trial happens then, yeah.
seeing what information might come from the case, from the trial,
Sure.
if it goes to
Sure.
trial. He pled not
Yeah.
guilty, but and I'm sure
Yeah.
we'll see what
Yeah.
happens.
Well, if I could just say something about that $5 million bond or bail, whatever it is, I can tell you that of course my listeners have been following that, and they were surprised that he got bail at all. They were surprised he just wasn't remanded. I mean, he's being charged with murder, and he's tried to get away with it for 35 years, and he lives in another state, on and on and on. They were even surprised that there was any bail at all. They were surprised that he just didn't get put in jail, and he's just going to have to wait until the trial happens. That was their impression.
Yeah. All right. So, David, pass it to you.
Sure. Hi, Ed. Good evening. Always a pleasure.
Good to see you.
Some things stand out to me right away in this case. Now, of course, I don't have anything factual information. This is all strictly opinionated. But one, like you had mentioned, there could be several copycat individuals who may be suffering from some sort of mental disorders, which often happens when they try to take the blame for a crime that they did not commit. That you've already mentioned. That obviously stands out, and we've seen that time and time again.
Yeah.
As far as the case details, I think the only thing that saved him in the beginning was the fact that his daughter was riding home with him when he dropped this poor child off.
Russell Ross, you're talking about.
Right.
Russell Ross is the one who dropped them. Yeah. And it was a former coworker of Steve's. Yes.
Right. And was it Steve that was the one who's in jail now?
Steve is the one that's been charged with the murder, and Russell Ross was his former coworker who dropped Janelle off that evening. Yeah.
It's just something doesn't sit right with me. One, obviously you don't know if the garage door is open or not.
That's what Russell said. We can only go by, he was the one that was there.
We only have a one-sided story from one individual who can clearly say anything to take the attention away from himself. But the details of the case seem a little bit strange to me. And as far as the evidence, in my opinion, in cases that I've studied in the past, I don't see that a judge, especially on a 35-year-old case, would remand somebody on $5 million bond if they didn't have significant evidence against this individual.
I agree with you. On the other hand, I just wonder if there was so much pressure, being that this is so high profile. It's 35 years old. It's a little girl. It's Steve Pankey, who kind of is a weird guy anyway. And is that just what they said? Well, he's so weird, he had to have done it. Look what he's done. Look what he said and all these things.
Well, luckily we live in a country that, you can't be charged with a crime just because you're weird.
I know that. But
yeah.
Thank God for that.
Yeah, right. That's right. But we're all just human,
Yeah.
And
I just think
there might have been some public pressure here to get this all solved. And we have to remember that the mayor of the town was a cop at the time in 1984 when this happened, and that he might have, there might have been some political pressure there too. Maybe.
We'll see.
It would have just been really nice to see some sort of DNA evidence come about, but it's highly unlikely.
If they have it, I've not heard about it. And I can't believe there would be anything meaningful on the remains of bones that have been out buried for 35 years.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting.
Yeah, it certainly will.
Yeah.
Josh, what's your take on this?
It's actually really funny because one point that I do want to bring up is I don't have a lot of personal details, but one thing I did is I used to job shadow back home when I first was in high school, and I really enjoyed being able to go out on the field with everybody. And what happened one day is that due to new DNA evidence, so I kind of want to stay hopeful just with this part of the comment, is that they were going through it was about an 80s case as well, where a mafia had shot somebody through a car, and what had happened is they had actually found a cigarette butt due to new DNA evidence somewhere lodged in a seat or somewhere. So I just think it's really interesting from y'all kind of stating those points, that it's always stay hopeful with these old cases. You never know what kind of evidence, especially with kind of how you've talked about these missing person cases, is you just never know what's going to pop up.
Nope,
It's always
you
a
don't.
day by day hopeful. And I think you even said it last show. The best part about a missing person's case, is luck.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of them are solved that way. And as I
Yeah.
stated, if they had not been digging out there, putting this pipe in or whatever, her
Mhm.
remains would still be out there.
And not only that, but I definitely kind of had some questions just because I was really glad David kind of answered more so about the personal aspects of the case. That got rid of like half the stuff I kind of like typed up throughout the show but I will say, just due to like recent classes, as well as like this whole interview, is what's got my mind so boggled with him kind of like trying to talk to you. Just due to like a recent class of like interview techniques throughout that podcast, which of course I'll probably go back and watch. Would you say that you noticed any possible strong like basic kinesis principles of, like the nervousness, or like and you said he's a weird guy, so
He's just
did he come straight on and he just looked like the camera straight in the eyes and just like you even said, weird
well,
guy,
I don't get
mental
to
issues?
see him. I only get to listen to him.
Gotcha.
And to mine, the way I remember it of the interview is that he told a strange story regarding his father-in-law, and there's other details that I didn't have time to go into for this hour. But there were no contradictions in his story. Okay. I mean, granted, if he killed her, he's had 35 years to get his story straight. And he's probably sat down and looked at all the ins and outs and make sure that it all makes sense. All I can do is ask the toughest questions that I can. It's up to the listeners to decide if he's telling the truth or not. But in my opinion, he told no contradictions. That doesn't mean he told the truth.
So, Ed, I have another question that is more general, not to do with this case, but more to do with your work.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like in this case, where we're mentioning people's names because it's part of the facts of the case. Do you ever worry about any kind of defamation of character, lawsuits, or anything in that arena from a civil lawsuit and civil law perspective? What have
I
you
could
ever
say
had that in your years of doing this?
Sure. 4.5 years. I can tell you that I do have, I did in 2019. It had nothing to do with Steve's case, though. I did go to an attorney in late 2019 and spoke to him. I paid for an hour of his time to talk about the program, to talk about what I do. He listened to the program and everything else. He told me that from what he's heard that I am on firm legal ground as to what I'm doing. And this is one of the reasons, though, that we do not theorize on the program. We never say, well, if John Smith killed Jane Doe, then how did he do it? We don't do those types of things. All we do is say John Smith was the last one to see Jane Doe. And This is what happened afterwards. That's just a fact. I can't, as I've stated, I can't help it sometimes if some of the facts sometimes make people look guilty. I can't help that. Yes. But the truth, as the attorney stated, is always the number one defense against defamation. And so the listeners don't lie. I don't lie. Right. But I've gotten some threats. So I'm going to go to get a lawyer and this and that. And I said, well, I guess I'll just see you in court then. Yeah. And we'll just have to hash it out. But, a lot of times the names are out here, but I totally leave it up to the guests whether they want to say names or not. I can't control what they say. So sometimes they want to use fake names or just first names or no names or whatever else. Most of them don't mind using the full names. And a lot of times, most of those names are already out in the public anyway. Right.
Have you been in touch with the family?
I've not. They did not contact me after it. However, all I can say is that I have been in contact with somebody who knows Steve. But this person, until the trial was over and everything else, is not going to interview me about the case or anything until it's over. But somebody who has known Steve for a while, this person, knows him. But due to everything that's gone on, we're going to wait to do a talk, have a deep talk, or maybe we'll do an official interview. I don't know until after this is all over.
So we're not in touch with the family.
No, not at this time. I'd love to talk to them. It's not that I've ignored them or anything. They haven't contacted me. I did not get any flack from them or anybody who knows them regarding my interview with Steve. And I'm going to just take for granted that that means that they know about it and they thought I did the best job that I could and did not glamorize him in any way, that I tried to ask him the best questions that I could and had something come out of it. Then it very well may be that there may be something that he said during the interview with me that contradicts what he told police. And maybe that's what brought about him being charged. I don't know. You know,
Well,
I'm
public
you
record,
know,
right? I mean,
yeah,
so,
right.
you know, we're like right now we're live streaming on YouTube, which is
Right.
a public forum. And
Right.
so, you know, anything you say can and will be held against you.
That's right.
Kind of thing.
Right.
So,
And
careful what we say right now. But
right.
I mean, if anybody's watching, if anyone gets a hold of this YouTube live program, particularly the family of Jonelle, we want to really just
Sure.
remind our viewers and remind everyone that these are real cases and that these are real people.
Mhm.
And that these are real families that grieve and have unanswered questions. And if we're toying with this as sort of a criminal justice experiment, if you will, talking about the facts and looking at the law and kind of not theorizing, but just examining the case.
Yeah.
But it's a real case, and it
Yeah.
and it hurts deep. Right. So like, even like with COVID, we talk about, all of the people who have died, and it's a number, when you see it on the screen, on the news, and it's a number, but those numbers represent real people, and those real people are part of families. And so in this way, our hearts go out to Jonelle's family. Such a tragic loss of a 12-year-old girl whose life was completely cut short, and there's a lot of unanswered questions for them, and a lot of what we call in psychology complicated grief. And the reason it's complicated is because first she was missing and it was a disappearance, and then it was like, maybe there was some hope. But then when her remains were found,
Right.
then it was like the disappearance happens all over again.
Yep.
The trauma happens all over again, re-traumatization for the families. So and some people might say, oh, well, now they have closure. But,
No.
that's something that we try to stay away from that word.
Yep.
Because there is no closure.
No.
You don't resolve this, even if this goes to trial, and it is going to trial, and he's found guilty or not guilty or whatever the outcome is going to be, it still remains a broken heart for the family.
Sure.
Right. And that's why we really love what you do, Ed, because you give voice to the families and you give voice to these victims who have not been found.
Yeah. My impression, I really don't know. I've not seen a lot. I don't know how many interviews the Matthews family has done over the last 30 some years. I don't know how much they've been in the public. I certainly would not decline to talk to them and everything, but my impression is that for the most part, they've kind of stayed out of the media. And of course, on top of everything else, when a disappearance gets to be 35 years old, the odds of remains being found 35 years later are so remote. Now it happened. Of course, we know it happened. Right. And so at some point, it's true. I'm not putting this on the Matthews, but I do know that a lot of families just give up. And they just, move on, and they say, well, if our loved one's going to be found, then it's going to happen. But we have, lives to lead. It's affected us emotionally and everything. But the reason you don't sometimes see some families in the news talking about their missing loved one is because it hurts, and because they think, it's maybe just time to move on. And
and then you also see a lot of families get involved in advocacy work.
Sure. And that's another direction that many people go. Absolutely.
We see some families who have become devastated by this, and divorce, resulting in alcohol or drug addiction. So a whole host of psychological outcomes that are deleterious, that are negative, that are not good, happen as a result of this traumatic event. that has kind of fractured the family.
Yeah.
So we thank you again for always, bringing these important cases to light and talking about things that, even though they're so old. I mean, look, in this case, now it's not so old anymore. It's old,
Nope.
but it isn't
It's
old.
front and center, and it's going to even
Front
be
and
more
center.
front and center come this summer, I guess, if that's when the trial is going to occur. Yes.
Exactly. So Ed, we really we thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule
I love
and
it.
committing
talking
to
to you.
this collaboration monthly.
Yeah.
Our
Great.
next Unfound program will be on April 22nd. It's a Thursday at 7 o'clock. We have
Okay.
yet to talk about what case we will look at and examine.
Okay.
But
Okay.
Ed, did you want to talk about how the viewers, most of these viewers are probably your followers.
They're very,
Anyway.
some of them are very faithful, and I love every one
know.
of them. So
So
yes.
if you want to let our viewers know on YouTube, because this gets
Mm-hmm.
archived on our Facebook page so that people
Mhm.
could see it if they had missed it live. But let our viewers know how they can see more of your shows.
Absolutely. The Unfound episodes come out on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Podomatic, and a whole host of other podcast platforms. 2 p.m. Eastern every Friday. Sometimes they come out a little earlier depending on what I have going on that day, but I usually let people know. But you can find Unfound on Facebook. We have a huge discussion group with about 8,000 members on it. We have the Unfound page, which I think has over 8,000 or something like that likes. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Twitter every day with posting articles and links. Instagram, where I post pictures of the missing people that we are going to feature or have featured on the program. There is the website. My assistant Tasha does a fantastic job there. I think it's one of the best true crime websites out there for a podcast, theunfoundpodcast.com. A whole host of links and materials and videos and things on that site. If you'd like to contact me, it's my email is unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. We have a very popular YouTube channel with almost 12,000 subscribers where I do a live show on Wednesday nights. All of the audio episodes eventually get loaded up there. I do map supplements for some of the podcasts that are just audio. It's a very, very popular YouTube channel. I take great pride in it. Natasha does a great job along with some of the other assistants putting that all together as well.
Yes.
That's what we do.
Thank you. And speaking of YouTube channels, for everyone who's viewing now, if you haven't subscribed to the Fischler College of Education School of Criminal Justice YouTube channel,
yes.
Please do. And then hit the bell for notifications for when we go live. We have, and Ed, I really want to put a plug out here for this. April 12th, we have Dr. Catherine Ramslin, who is going to be our guest. And it is a webinar. And I'm going to share the link with you so that you can invite your folks to the webinar.
Yes.
Then they get an opportunity. It's also going to be live streamed on YouTube, but being a part of the webinar will give your viewers and your followers the ability to actually interact with Dr. Ramslin if they're interested. Her show is going to be on Confessions of a Serial Killer. She interviewed the BTK killer. So she's a forensic psychologist. She's world-renowned author of over 60 books on forensics. And as I said,
Dennis Rader, right? BTK, Dennis Rader.
Yep. And so she's going to be on April 12th. Mark your calendars for that. And I'm going to send you the link so that you can.
I'm sure they will be very interested in that.
I think they'd like that. Yeah. So anyway, thank you again. Let me remove my spotlight so we could show Ed one more time. And Ed, thank you again. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jessica Rodriguez, who is our behind the scenes marketing person who's always does a lot of work to get us to where we're at. And I appreciate her. I appreciate our Dean Durham, Dean Tammy Kushner, Dr. Kushner, and Dr. Marcelo Castro. For those of you also, your followers who might be interested in a little bit more educational perspective on all of this in our criminal justice programs, we've got the undergrad program, we've got the master's, and we've got the PhD. I put the links all in there. It's on the YouTube chat. So if they're interested, or they could always contact me. And if they want to contact me, GT243 at Nova.